By 1948, Brenda was still having weekly choir rehearsals, enjoyed swimming, knitting and sewing, and was going to the cinema 2 or 3 times a week with friends. Her open, friendly nature in the telephone exchange ensured her popularity, and she was soon made social secretary, a post she probably relished, as it provided her with fresh opportunities to find the one, following the departure of the armed forces from Penwith. She arranged a joint dinner and dance with the men from Skewjack, the listening post at RAF Sennin, whose corresponding social secretary was a pleasant and handsome young lad called John Wootton. Brenda was a popular and very attractive girl, and as we've seen, had already had many boyfriends. She hadn't been backwards in coming forwards when the American soldiers arrived during World War II, but it was John who was to capture her heart. Unfortunately, her first meeting with John isn't recorded, as she gives up keeping her diary around that time, too busy doing other things, presumably. Johnny Wootton, as he was called then, had also had quite a few girlfriends in his home territory of Wolverhampton, where he'd lived prior to the war and his Cornish posting. His father, George Edward Wootton, was the gardener for both the Wolverhampton boys' and girls' grammar schools, and amazingly, he grew all the fresh fruit and vegetables for the school canteens. They actually lived in a cottage in the school grounds. John was a radio telecommunications technician for the RAF during the war and was stationed in Ceylon, and I'm very glad to say never saw active service, though he did, years later, receive the Standard War Medal. In contrast to the horrors of the war raging elsewhere, John's diary from the war years reveals a life of comparative calm and ordered routine in Ceylon. There were frequent visits to the cinema and occasional mentions of his work, but almost every day he records writing letters to a variety of girlfriends. Brenda, too, enjoyed the movies as a young girl. She has said, "The cinema was very important in my young life. It was in the Gaiety Cinema in Newlyn that I had my first grown-up date when I was 14 years old. He bought me chocolates and ate most of them himself." Brenda became engaged to John Wootton on her 20th birthday, the 10th of February 1948. In her diary, she records visiting the Gaiety again. "Saw ideal husband. Not as good as mine," she commented, anticipating her forthcoming wedding. The sheer volume of the correspondence between the young couple at that time was monumental. I still have over 100 apiece of their passionate daily tomes, covering the few months in 1948 and 49, when John still had to work out his job in Wolverhampton, both before and after the wedding, whilst Brenda remained in Daniel Place in Penzance with Lena and Angus. They were married in the Alexandra Road Methodist Church in Penzance on the 3rd of July that year, and honeymooned for a week in Stratford-on-Avon. Initially, John went back up to Wolverhampton alone and was later joined by Brenda, and for a short while the young couple lived on the grammar school site with John's father, George. Brenda found him somewhat curmudgeonly, so she was pleased to make the move back down to Cornwall in June 1949, just in time for a momentous event. In November 49, I was born, upstairs in Daniel Place in Penzance, with no midwife, but none the worse for that. I, too, am pleased that Brenda chose to return to Cornwall at that time, most likely remembering her own regretted accident of birth. For that first year back home in Cornwall, like so many young couples, Brenda and John lived with her parents, Lena and Angus, in Daniel Place. When browsing through Father's logbook from his earliest days as a radio ham, I was touched to see that there were a couple of occasions in the first year of their married life when Brenda was making some of the written entries. It appears the young bride was permitted to enter the inner sanctum of the shed and join in the fun. Well, the wheels soon come off that, as they say. Sennin, the first and last parish in Britain, straggles along the last few miles of road in the country before Land's End. It has 3 distinct and fairly self-explanatory areas. Residents were identified by their location, and at different times we classed as all of them. Churchtowners live anywhere in the region of the church, down towards Land's End. Covers live down in the cove itself, and Overillers live on top of the cove and back along the A30. John started work at Skewjack near Sennin in September 1949, and by October 1950 they managed to rent a large rambling house close to his job, down near Land's End. Atlantic breezes, a woefully understated euphemism for the reality, where we lived for just over a year. It was the last house on the left before Land's End, and my only memory of it is the field below the house, bordered with trees, which always seemed to be filled with anemones. Baby Susan's first word, apparently, was book, and as a baby I'm told I was fond of reading the Radio Times upside down. Brenda and John, like many other newlyweds, struggled to make ends meet, and over the next few years Brenda taught herself all the money-saving tips she could, making jams and preserves, ends to middling sheets, making her own tea towels and pillowcases, and designing and making her own clothes. All practices she continued throughout her life when she could. Recycling is not a new idea. In November 51 we became covers and moved down to Beechfield, a large granite house right in the centre of the cove, and instantly upgraded from being churchtowners to covers. The bottom of the cove was the top of the tree. This was a close-knit community, of necessity, really, cut off from the rest of the world, as it was, by that daunting Sennin Cove Hill. Many's the time the Sennin bus had to offload passengers part way, leaving them to walk up the steepest stretch to climb back on again at the top. Community and village life centred around the lifeboat, the cove's unifying force. The Sennin lifeboat house dominates the cove, and then, as now, the Sennin family names of Angove, Hutchins, Pascoe, Pender, George, Oliver, Nicholas and Shannon, from that day to this, dominated the crew list, and all their children were my school friends. Peter's son Adam, now a local GP, has been officially serving as crew for some years as the lifeboat's honorary medical advisor. Our house, Beechfield, was centre front, right by the sea, and appropriately named, as originally the house stood opposite what had once been tiny fields between the road and the shoreline, used to grow violets and anemones, some housing little wooden shacks, which I do remember, though the fields are long since washed into the sea and now replaced by a strong seawall. Next door lives someone I only ever heard referred to as Mare Trere. I'm guessing now her name was Mary Trenary. She was an old lady I dimly remember, wearing the long dark skirt and white pinny of the Victorian Cornish granny. I was a little frightened of her, and only ever saw briefly into her house, down a long dark passage with coloured lights at the end. Stained glass window, probably. A few doors to the other side lived Marjorie Thomas and her family. I was great friends with daughter Catherine, who had a big sister called Wendy, and Marjorie attended Senin WI, as of course did Brenda. There were many friendships forged there, and many a WI member was persuaded to take part in the village pantomimes. Betty George and Mrs. Maitland I remember particularly as unlikely harem girls in diaphanous trousers. There was a little grocer's shop down opposite the lifeboat house, now a lovely cafe, and next door to it a knitting shop, which I recall as being owned by the delightfully named Marigold, or did I dream that? The bus from Penzance called quite regularly, and a large space between the houses on the front was kept vacant as the bus turning space, as is still the case today. For me, for any child, Sennin Cove was an idyllic place to live. Every day, rain or shine, I was down on the beach. Eyes down, wet ass no fish, as mother used to say, squatting in rock pools, leaping over or scrambling among the boulders, finding treasures, paddling in the foamy waves, building dens in nooks and crannies, damming the stream at Vellandreath, or cartwheeling down the sand dunes. Brenda used to bring me down a sandwich and some homemade lemonade to keep me going. I couldn't have wished for a better childhood. I learned to swim off the lifeboat slip in the harbour, learned to love the wildlife, the wild winter waves and the people. Getting to Sunday school up that hill was a bit of a challenge, especially on cold wintry days, but it was a small price to pay. Despite living quite away from town, I still spent a lot of time with my lovely grandparents in Penzance, where I was Angus's Queen of the Roses. In early 1954 we moved again, back up the hill to Treve Moor, almost the last house before Land's End on the right this time. A wonderful big old granite house with barn and a small plot of land, rented from a lovely couple, Bod and Dick Trenary. Bod was actually Mrs. E. Trenary, who taught at Sennin School for many years. She'd left before I started there. And it's good to report the house is still in the family. There was no electricity, so John set about teaching himself how to make a wind-powered generator. And there was certainly plenty of that natural resource at Land's End. In the winter storms, the wind moaned and howled around the house like a crazed wild animal, searching out crevices and cracks. But we were safe and warm in the parlour, with a blazing fire, and basking in the gentle golden glow of the tilly lamps softly hissing. The eerie sound of that wind still makes me feel safe and comforted today. There was a well in the garden, useful if the pipes froze, next to which was an old piece of corrugated iron sheeting, which was often home to a family of slowworms, while a huge conch shell beside the front door was the domain of a big old toad. There was a cold scullery to the left of the front door, with a large marble slab for preparing fish, and a zinc-screened meat safe, and in the kitchen on the right was an original Cornish range. It needed regular blackleading and was messy to operate, but Brenda took full advantage, firing up the slab and producing some of the tastiest pasties I ever remember. As a toddler, I was washed in front of it in the old tin bath. Trevemore was home to some of my earliest memories, including some much-loved yet inexpensive toys. The family's economies spread to presents for me, but they were none the less adored. One such was Bruno, the huge bear, all 4 foot of him. Father bought him for 6pence in the church jumble sale, and I was still snuggling in bed beside him in my teenage years, using his flattened straw-filled belly as an extra pillow. I remember waking early one Christmas morning in great excitement to spy some strange shapes hanging on the end of my bed. A pair of string puppets, a man and a woman, made for me by Brenda and John. Father had made the bodies out of old cotton reels and dowling, and Brenda made their clothes. I was thrilled with them, and I still treasure a slightly ragged little black and white panda bear bought for me as a christening present by my Uncle Peter. Frugality was the watchword. There were various money-making schemes attempted. For a few years, Brenda and John took in Royal Marine Commandos, stationed at Land's End for cliff-climbing exercises. I remember Happy Days and Chalky White were regulars, and one of them, Dan Allen, bet Brenda she couldn't make a pasty so big that he wouldn't be able to finish it. She could barely fit it in the slab, but she won. The commandos were also very amenable to helping out with the preparations on November the 5th, building a huge bonfire for us, as well as supplying some very spectacular and unorthodox rockets, illegally, of course. I was very popular among my friends on bonfire night that year. Another scheme which ultimately failed dismally was keeping geese. It had been suggested as a great ruse. Geese cost hardly anything to feed and produced wonderful eggs which could be eaten, and the spares sold, they were advised, quite apart from the bonus of a proper goose at Christmas. So Brenda and John eagerly acquired a small gaggle of around 6. John had to go to some effort to build a suitably sized pen, and then a house for shelter. Hoppers were needed for food, and the geese simply refused to eat household scraps, so food had to be bought. The biggest and feistiest of the gaggle was Tallulah, and not only was she unapproachable without risk of attack, she was also a great escape artist. No matter how high John raised the fence, she sometimes, somehow, managed to fly over it and had to be chased and caught. In the end, a howling storm one night brought the pen down, and the geese fled, never to be seen again. Not even a goose for Christmas that year. Food I remember from the 50s. Fish were prepared in the cold scullery on the marble slab. Living in the fishing village of Senin had its benefits, and fresh fish was a cheap and nutritious food that was relished, often straight off the boats. The local fishermen would hawk their wares door to door, especially for regular customers. Soused mackerel, marinated or pickled in vinegar and spices, was popular, but more often mackerel just fried in butter was a very quick and tasty option. As Brenda explained in her song Thunder and Lightning, "Now take a mackerel out the sea, oh souse it they all say, my cock just puttin' in the pan and fryin' straight away." If money was tight and the fish weren't biting, perhaps it would be the salty toe rag, dried salt cod that needed soaking at least overnight to withdraw as much of the salt as possible. My favourite was a wing of ray, a sweet bitter fish, boiled taties and butter to make a rich dish, and with the added bonus of the white meat being easily removed from the bones. If Angus and I had been on a recent winkling expedition, there'd be a saucer of boiled winkles with a little vinegar and salt, and a slice of thin bread and butter, and a pin, of course. Meat was usually a bit more expensive, but if they were feeling flush, under roast was always popular, and raw fry as well. Cornish recipes which can be found in many good regional cookbooks. Cheaper cuts prevailed. Angus's favourite was pig's trotters. John favoured tripe. Pasties were also an economical and, of course, much-loved meal, although very labour-intensive. The best meat for pasties is the cheaper cut of marbled skirt, as it makes for a juicier filling, and Brenda often used flaky pastry. Lena taught Brenda well, and we always looked forward to pasty day. In fact, Brenda always said you had to let the family know in the morning if you were making pasties that day, as the anticipation was part of the enjoyment. Each person's pasty would be marked with their initial on one corner in pastry, so if you couldn't eat it all at one go, as was usually the case, the saved corner would still be identifiable later. This poem she wrote many years later. P is for the pastry, not too rich to start. A's the way you make it, for it truly is an art. S is for the skirt beef, which provides the handsome juice. T is for the turnip, so tender, rich and loose. Y is you who eat it, the best meal in the world. I salute the Cornish pasty, under Cornish flag unfurled. The essential drink to accompany a pasty, by the way, is always a cup of hot sweet tea. While we're on pasties, I must just mention a chap from over Newlyn, as told to me by Angus. Joe Perry had a hare lip, and consequently a bit of a speech impediment. His missus made him a pasty for his dinner every single day. But one day he was horrified to come home to find she'd decided to ring the changes and made him stew. "No," he cried, "I don't want no bloody new. Pasties I work for, and pasties I shall have." Oh, and not forgetting the poor widower Brenda met, forced to make his own pasties once his wife had gone, trying to close his pasty with safety pins, because he couldn't manage the crimping properly. Any leftover pastry was filled with jam and made into a jam pasty for pudding. Other artery-clogging desserts we often enjoyed, cheap and filling steam puddings like Spotted Dick with custard, Yorkshire puddings with treacle or treacle tart, Blackberry and fruit tarts, of course, or maybe junket with Cornish clotted cream, which she sometimes made herself, a long but rewarding process which involved scalding the milk in a wide, shallow pan and eventually skimming off the thick, luscious cream. Brenda also made excellent homemade lemonade from a recipe of Lena's. Any sudden glut of fruit or vegetables was always put to good use, pickled or made into jams, fruit tarts or chutneys, and glass jars were never thrown away. The WI provided invaluable information for impoverished housewives on pickling, bottling and preserving. No fridges or freezers or plastic in those days. And every year without fail, come September would be the blackberrying. We'd all go out searching, and having found a likely picking ground, usually field hedges, country lanes, or cliff tops, we'd each choose our own spot and cootie down and guard it jealously while we picked it clean, with the warning call, "Cootie cootie io, anybody come round here get a black io." Years later she wrote a poem, serious for once, about blackberry picking at Lamorna, which began, "Last September we lined the willow basket with rusty curled bracken, filled it to the brim with the best berries, no scruff, cootie cootie io." No fast foods or heavily processed foods then. We collected fresh wild watercress from clear, clean streams, wild mushrooms from the fields, eggs came from a local farm, and Brenda and John grew what they could in the wind-battered garden. They even had a go at homemade wines. Gorse, elderflower and parsnip, I remember. All in all, I think our diet was pretty healthy. When Father was working nights at Skewjack, Brenda would sometimes suggest our special treat tea. Egg banjos followed by banana sandwiches. This was our fast food. An egg banjo is basically a fried egg sandwich, and I suspect it had more to do with Brenda not wanting to get involved in major cooking, but to me it was our snuggling in front of the fire secret comfort food. I don't remember Brenda making much saffron cake, possibly because saffron itself is devilishly expensive, although Lena did from time to time. But Evie cake was a staple, made with plain, not self-raising flour. And the ultimate wicked sweet treat was, of course, thunder and lightning, a thick slice of fresh bread drizzled with treacle, actually golden syrup, which makes the bread slightly crispy, although many will argue the cream should go on first. It's personal choice, really, and smothered in a thick coating of clotted cream. Apart from cooking, Brenda found plenty down at Land's End to keep her busy. Her first adult attempt at oil painting, a hobby she enjoyed all her life, was made at Treve Moor. Unsurprising, given that both her father and brother were artists. It was obviously in the blood. Brenda and John took full advantage of the wonderful countryside, the cliffs and the beaches, and walks and picnics happened whenever possible, which at least countered the nutritious eating somewhat. The picnics often took on something of an epic quality. As well as all the food and drink, fizzy lemonade tablets and bottles of water, and the usual paraphernalia, rugs, umbrellas, beach gear, there was often Brenda's paint box, easel, boards and brushes as well. She loved to paint en plein air, outdoors, and many of these early paintings made it onto the wall in her front room, which became a gallery of happy events that I still keep up on my front room wall today, each one a fond memory of a blissful childhood outing. After the Annus Horribilis of 1994, when both Brenda and John died, I discovered on clearing the paintings from the wall that years after the event, she'd written a short paragraph on the back of each one of those picnic paintings, describing the day, what the weather had been like, anything of interest that had happened. One such was a painting of an old barn on Cerrow Farm at the foot of Chapel Cambrai, near Land's End Airfield at St Just. Not sure how we managed to access the site to drag the picnic there, but I remember the day, as a big old sow ambled up to watch her while she worked and tried to eat the paints. You remember things like that. The barn is still there, unchanged, and I see it regularly. Her paintings done in the 50s and 60s have a natural quality that I love. Like Angus, her style was impressionist, and her particular interests were sun on granite walls and old barns. She loved the warmth and solidity, the history they held. This was her comment about her first adult painting of a gateway at Treve Moor. My first adult painting all around Treve Moor was dry stone walling. The sun would set through the stones. We could hear the rocket of longships sounding through the fog. The winds could reach 130 miles per hour. Oil lamps, cook on the slab, carry water. We were very happy here. In those days we never had a car, and John rode to work on his old motorbike, which, as it did have a sidecar, at least meant that me and the picnic gear could be carried short distances, with Brenda riding pillion. As the years passed, she became very involved with the local community. Village activities she says she was active in include church, chapel, WI, council, drama, life-saving and bed and breakfast. At Christmas time, we joined forces with others and walked around the farmsteads for miles around, carol singing, usually fundraising for the Senin Drama Group or some other local cause. Electricity didn't come to Senin until 1933, and streetlights were still few and far between in the 1950s, so the locals were used to traipsing round in the dark. But John made improvised candle lanterns out of tin cans on bamboo poles for everyone to carry, which served the purpose admirably. In 1954, I started at Senin School, a wonderful establishment that thrives today. Then the headmistress lived on site, and there were just 2 classes, with playgrounds and a large playing field at the back. My favourite memory of the school, the nature table, and nature rambles down the country lane, and Brer Rabbit reading books. My least favourite, sports day and the egg and spoon and sack races. Oh, and the pickled adder in a jar. Useful, though, to know what to avoid on the country walks. Always stamp heavily walking along cliff paths. Scares them off. Beside the school, the old flooded quarry, still there today, was a favourite spot for tadpole hunts. As I was nearly 5 at that first term, I was one of the older children in that class, and by the following year, as a precocious reader, I'd been moved up a year, though I was not precocious at sums. At my first school medical, it was recognised that I had some health problems, and before too long I was diagnosed with what was then called a hole in the heart. Normally such problems are detected at birth, as the newborn is a blue baby, but apparently I was not sufficiently blue for anyone to notice. It was actually a hole in the aorta, the main valve leading into the heart, which meant that half of my blood was not being reoxygenated. I needed a specialist heart operation, and at the time Brenda and John were told that the nearest specialist was in London, that I might have to wait for 2 years, and the chances of a successful outcome were 50-50. But without the operation, I was unlikely to make it past my teens. This was a very traumatic time for them. Not me so much, as I had no idea of the gravity of the situation and was little affected at the time. The main issue being I got out of breath and tired easily. Still do, I'm obviously in my second childhood. Eventually they were told a specialist surgeon had moved to Bristol and there would be a 6-month wait. Then a specialist moved to Cornwall, and within short order, at age 6, I was sent to the delightfully placed Tehiddy Hospital in Camborne, long since closed. The operation, the first of its kind in the West Country, was a great success. Obviously, as I write this over 60 years later, and the recovery period was 6 weeks. Needless to say, I have ever since been thankful for my reprieve, for the skill of the surgeons and nurses, and for the blessing of the NHS. Long may it survive against the current outrageous odds. I had a great time. My chief memory of the whole event was that I got lots of nice presents, and the only unpleasant bit was having the stitches out and getting my kit off in front of the doctor at my annual checkups as I approached puberty. With great consideration for young girls, they entered the chest cavity at the side rather than down the centre front, which was apparently the preferred option for boys. So I acquired an impressive scar running around the shoulder blade down to right under the arm, with no embarrassing impact on my future décolletage. It was many years later that Brenda told me she'd had several miscarriages while living at Sennin. At least 3, I believe. She told me 5. Father later remembered only 3. But then he wasn't experiencing them. This certainly contributed to her weight gain. Apparently her stomach muscles had collapsed when I was born, and she was unable to maintain a pregnancy after that, although she kept trying. On one of these occasions, all of which I was blissfully unaware of at the time, while I was in Tehiddy recovering from my heart operation, Father set out from Sennin on his motorbike and sidecar to visit both me in Tehiddy and Brenda in Treliske hospitals following yet another miscarriage, and came off his bike at Burius Bridge, which then had a low stone wall beside a narrowing of the road over the stream. He ended up in West Cornwall Hospital with a smashed ankle. So all 3 of us were in different Cornish hospitals at the same time. God bless the NHS. Around this time, I was appointed Fairy Queen at Sennin Carnival, a huge honour. My Fairy King was Ronald Angove, the son of milkman Josie Angove. I've always suspected that my royal appointment was the result of a sympathy vote. From Treve Moor, in early 1956, we moved up to 18 Atlantic Crescent, the new estate on the top of the hill, and became Over Illers. Easier for both my walk to school and John's drive to work. We had a lion-maned black and white cat called Moppet, and briefly a wild hedgehog in the kitchen, and an orphaned wild rabbit in an elaborate hutch John built in the garden, which sadly it never lived to enjoy for long. I came a cropper on my tricycle here, and subsequently, like Brenda, never owned or rode a bike. My friends and I made a secret den in the long grass opposite the houses, where a large rectangular hole had been dug, exposing an oblong, table-sized granite boulder. The hole was covered in a corrugated metal sheet, and we enjoyed hiding beneath it, illicitly taking down candle stubs and matches to hold secret meetings crouching in the mouldy earth. More new houses were being built at the back, and they seemed to have been left half-built forever. This was a good place for playing house. The main source of fun and days out with picnics for all of us was straight down Sunny Corner Lane to the dunes of Vellandreath at the far end of Sennin Beach. Every so often an old man in a black coat would come knocking at the door, carrying a huge lidded box at the front, supported by a strong strap around his shoulders. He was a peddler, selling all manner of small household items, sewing notions, buttons, zips, shoelaces, cleaning materials, scissors, kitchen equipment, and more. Brenda was always pleased to see him, and always bought something from him. I was amazed at what he would bring out of his box, and he always had a little something to give to the children. A little plastic animal, some pretty ribbons, and always something special at Christmas, like a tree ornament. He was quite diffident, but very friendly, and would chat happily to anyone. I only recently discovered he was the same much-loved local character, Cloggy or Albert Meller, who I remembered later as being well known throughout West Cornwall for playing his barrel organ, one of two he owned in towns and at events, wherever people gathered. He wore clogs, naturally, and originally had had a real monkey on his barrel organ, but apparently gave it up when it bit him and substituted a toy one. He was the last itinerant organ grinder working in the West Country, and had a definite summer tour, even visiting the Scillies. He died in 1985. Particular friends for many years, such I knew them as auntie and uncle, though they weren't related, were Jean and Nicky Hards, who lived at Porthcurno. Nicky fished out of Sennin, and the couple had two daughters who became good friends, Gloria and Colleen. The elder, Gloria, was about my age, and we often stayed over in each other's houses, secretly listening to Radio Luxembourg under the bed covers, had joint bonfires on Guy Fawkes Night, and visited frequently at Christmas and throughout the year. Nicky was a taciturn man, his serious expression enlivened sometimes with a warm chuckle. Jean I remember especially for her soft, low mousel burr and her frequent, "Oh, the dear of 'em." I mourn for the evenings of homemade entertainment, which kept us amused at Jean and Nicky's and elsewhere. Nobody seems to play games anymore, not proper games, and they were such an important part of my childhood. They weren't so much boughten games, but more usually devised by Brenda or gleaned from old games books. At family parties, we would have team games. The drawing game, no skill required, where each team had to guess, without the other hearing, the meaning of a scribbled drawing, no words, from their teammate, who had to stay dumb and just gestured wildly to convey his current object. A rubber band, maybe, or the Queen's left ear, or the pith of an orange. Not easy and inevitably hilarious. I remember a game which required 3 of the party, Peter, say, and 2 others, consulting secretly, then presenting themselves in front of the audience. 3 jolly workmen come to see for work. Audience. What can you do? Peter. All sorts and everything, just the same as you. And then followed some sort of dumb Crambo type of mime, where the object was for the watchers to guess their jobs. Another drawing game involved holding a blank sheet of paper on a book on top of your head, and following instructions to draw on it, blindly, a house, then a fence, then a tree in the garden, then a path, then windows and a door, and falling about, laughing at the results. Then charades, maybe, a homemade beetle game, a race to reassemble mismatched newspapers, or making hats with newspaper and a few pins. And for the children, feeding each other cornflakes while blindfolded and wearing a pinny round the neck. Making up poetry often featured. Here's an example from Angus, written at Jean and Nicky's, about Jan Yeats, who was with us that night. I wish I was a little fly, I'd fly from place to place. I'd land on top of Yeats's head and wee-wee down his face. Even good board games seemed to be dying out. Cluedo and Careers were our favourites. The TV and the internet may be wondrous things, but they have a lot to answer for. During a recent visit to Cornwall Record Office in Truro, researching this book, I was astonished to discover an anecdote of Brenda from this period, which was complete news to me. It's 1955, and Brenda, mother of a young child and a full-time homemaker, is living on Atlantic Crescent, a small estate at the top of Sennin. She knows she has a good singing voice, but apart from a couple of public performances when she was a schoolgirl or in the chapel choir, she has never stood in front of an audience to sing solo as an adult. Her self-image is likely at an all-time low. Since giving birth 5 years ago, she has ballooned from the glamorous young woman who paraded down the street in heels, head held high, into a frumpy-dumpy housewife. She's good at her role, though, and as well as looking after young Susan, spends her days cooking, cleaning, doing housework and listening to the wireless. The Land's End WI had decided to put on a play, a first for them, and for some reason had selected Hans Christian Andersen's story of the Emperor and the Nightingale. An odd choice, as they had no member with the singing skill to play the role of the real Nightingale. The play was cast, all but the real Nightingale. No one could think of any member suitable to play the part. One day the producer, Bill Maitland, is walking close to the open window of his near neighbour, Brenda Wootton, and overhears her singing along to the BBC Housewife's Choice. He is struck at once by the purity of her voice and realises his search for a real Nightingale is over. However, it takes some persuasion to get Brenda to perform. According to the Annals of Land's End WI, from whose The Story of RWI this account was taken, she only agrees as the play they have selected doesn't need her to stand on the stage in front of an audience, something she is apparently loath to do. The sweet voice of the nightingale in the play is only heard through an open window. Quoting from the book, "We played to a packed church hall, and after the final curtain the audience insisted on the real nightingale taking a curtain call, which she did to ecstatic applause. As a result of this performance, Mrs. Brenda Wootton became a member of the Land's End WI and also a founder member of the Senin Drama Group." I'm struck by this account for several reasons. It sounds almost apocryphal, but from the authenticity of the source and the fact that I never heard this story from Brenda, it's very likely true. The WI were looking for a vehicle for their ladies' choir to put on performances and dances to entertain the old people to whom they supplied meals on wheels. The role of the real nightingale could have been tailor-made for Brenda, and this seems like such a serendipitous, life-changing and iconic moment. It draws her out into the public gaze for the first time, and it's particularly strange to me as I've never heard it before. It seems now that this performance and enforced public appearance was the trigger which brought back her self-confidence and set her on the path which brought her ultimately to the stages and the spotlights of Paris. But this wasn't the last time that Brenda was reluctant to enter the spotlight. Although once that first applause at the Count House died away, she had by then been hooked. We made many good friends as Churchtowners, Covers and Overillers. The families of Joy and Chrissy Went, Sally Ellis, Laura Hutchins, Bernard Rodder, Leslie Trewin, Marjorie Thomas, the Shannons, the Maitlands, the Penders, the Angoves, the Georges. Being one of the first on the street to get a TV, small and square with a grainy black and white picture, certainly helped with my popularity amongst my peers. At Senin, Brenda began what became a lifelong love of the stage. Following on from her outing on stage with the WI, she and John, with others, were founder members of the Senin Drama Group in November 1956, which met regularly in the Little Church Hall. Both Brenda and John were on the group's committee and executive committee, which met up in members' houses, and the group soon acquired a large membership. They held regular play readings and produced 1- and 3-act plays, and then decided to put on a pantomime. They opened it up to the members to propose a story and plot, and Brenda's The Golden Goose was accepted. So she began to write the scripts. John was named as stage manager and props, and Brenda as scenery painter, but she soon widened her scope. The pantos became an annual event, and many local families were involved in some way, most of them petrified at their first attempt at treading the boards. Brenda says she and John were also involved in the inauguration of the Minack Theatre Society around the same time. There was a gaggle of Jackson lads whose family ran the store up over Ill, opposite Zachy Nicholas's garage. One of them, Bobby, had a joke to say on stage, which he thought so funny whilst he was at the same time so nervous, it caused him to stammer and stutter wildly. I live in a rude hut, he had to say. Oh yes, and why is it called a rude hut? was the feed line. Well, you should, hysterical giggles. You should see, more hysteria. You should see the writing on the walls, he finally spluttered out. Mike Sagar Fenton revived another memory of Bobby for me. I remember well the Senin postman with the stutter. He had a not very funny line. I had a girl once, she was 36, 24, 36, but that was just the shape of her head. It came out as, I had a girl once, and she was 24 and 36, and then came out all of a rush. But that was just the shape of her head, mind. No one caught the joke, of course, but for the cast it was the highlight of every show. Brenda's involvement with the pantomimes was total. As soon as one finished, she'd begin researching the next. She collected jokes from newspapers and joke books throughout the year and made use of local characters, incidents and events. I still have some of the fabulous antique books of fairy stories she amassed, looking for a story she could adapt to suit Senin and its folk. After the Golden Goose came Abu Hassan, Grizzly Beard, and the Shoes That Were Danced to Pieces, and the Rolling Stones of Pluinek, performed in 1964 with the Playgoers Theatre Group in Penzance. At the initial meeting, she would ask who would like to have a go, and always tried to include roles for everyone who wanted to participate. She arranged the publicity and the tours. They actually toured the local village and church halls with some of the pantos, carrying the flats, costumes and props with them, sometimes across muddy fields for one-night stands. There are records of pantos being taken to Pendine Sunday School, St Just British Legion, to St Buryan, Paul and Ludgvan village halls, to the Playgoers Theatre in Penzance, and even to the Cheshire Homes at Marazion. She was heavily involved in all of them. Generally, she wrote the scripts, made the costumes, did the makeup, produced, directed and acted. John made the props, built the flats, did the lighting and acted. Painting the scenery flats was a joyful communal affair, enriched by the pantomime stew, the stew pot bubbling away on an old primus in the hall, filled with everything contributed by everyone there, meat, veg, tinned stuff, whatever. Mike Sagar Fenton recalls, Brenda even danced, and I remember a song called You Bring Out the Savage in Me. Originally, this was a big, boastful tribal number, and in the middle she did a tribal-type dance with Vera. The tempo was quite fast and the dance quite demanding, so in rehearsal they found themselves completely out of breath, not to say knackered when it came to the final chorus. You'll find out how wild I can be, for you bring out the savage in me. Instead of booming it out, they literally tottered through it, wheezing, which was of course so funny they kept it in for every performance. Some of Brenda's lifelong friendships were forged from her Andram involvement. Vera Round, also one of the Chuffs group, wife of Arnold who lived at Marazion, did a wonderful parody of Joyce Grenfell and had a wicked sense of humour. She was known to me as Auntie V and came from Bolton, and was often heard to say, I could have been a film star if it wasn't for me face. Vera loved dancing, a pastime she pursued throughout her life, but her fall from grace was forgetting to wear her knickers one evening for one high-kicking performance. There was Doris Wernhardt, a British Drama League adjudicator, who, as an elocution teacher at West Cornwall Girls' School in Penzance, also took me for private speech lessons. Mike Sagar-Fenton, who I first remember as a young lad playing the drums for the panto, also wrote songs and worked with Brenda as a guitarist later in life. And then there was the inimitable and incorrigible Donald Jarvis. Donald lived at Sennin with his mum, his auntie and his uncle in a large house on the edge of the Atlantic Crescent estate. He worked for British Airways at Land's End Airport and at Penzance Heliport at Eastern Green. He was an excellent cook and a brilliant raconteur, particularly in Cornish dialogue, although his accent, when you met him, was more languid upper-class lovey, with his "Darling, how divine to see you!" He was so laid back he famously fell asleep on stage during one revue show they did together. One theatre group Brenda also often worked with in the late 50s and 60s was Madron Players. Leading lights Francis Monk, Vicar of Madron, and Mary Leighty, the dear of her, appeared in several plays and pantomimes, but Brenda also took the company through a couple of British Drama League festivals, reaching the semi-finals with The Mayor of Torrentall. This involved moving the entire company, costumes, props, makeup and scenery by coach to Leamington Spa for the event. Very exciting. Despite the 10-hour coach journey, I went along as props girl. Brenda remembers her association with the various local groups in Madron. My first contact with Madron Players was when the county drama advisor, John Trelease, asked me to produce The Smugglers of Sennin by Cornish bard Molly Bartlett. Also, she later recalled it as the first time she had sung Lamorna in public. Madron Players shared several members with Madron WI and Madron Young Farmers. And WI member Vida Pengelly, after some persuading from Brenda, proved a fine actress, as did the young Mary Leighty, heavily pregnant with Treve, who many years later was to build Brenda's house at New Mill. One very enthusiastic member of both the WI and Madron Players was Lady of the Manor Wilmay Le Grice of Treve, for whom the older residents of the village still tugged their forelock. Says Brenda, "I recall lovely fêtes at Treve Manor, donkey rides on the front lawn, wild flower competitions, Wilmay's gooseberry tarts in the kitchen, baby shows upstairs. I was given free rein of the manor, looking for props and furniture for many of the plays and shows. Upstairs in the attic, covered in dust and cobwebs, were priceless pieces of antique furniture. We borrowed some 19th century French bedroom chairs for the Mayor of Torrentall, and they were heaved into the back of Peter Lay's lorry, which broke down 5 times on the way back from Leamington Spa. We were given the freedom of the city of Leamington Spa, which basically meant we could borrow a library book or play tennis, but we didn't have time to do a thing other than the play competition. I was so scared we'd win and have to go on to Belfast for the Great Britain British Drama League finals. The whole of Madron, it seemed, had raised cash and looked after children to enable us to go to the semis. As it was, we came just 1 point behind the winners, so honour was satisfied. The children of Madron's Daniel School, named for the same benefactor as Daniel Place in Penzance, interestingly, were very lucky in their teacher, Francis Monk, but they couldn't believe their eyes when they saw Sir and the Mrs. LeGrice, in the feast concert, dressed in exotic Arabian costumes. Wilmays included baggy, translucent harem pants, and wolfing down a whole banana each during a performance of the comedy play Carpet Slippers. Other productions got to the quarter-finals in Truro City Hall, and here Doris Wernhard, J.P., reigned as one of the chief adjudicators. She was a remarkable woman, tall, with a chest like a ship in full sail, and a bird's nest of fiery henna-red hair perched wispily atop slate-grey sides. She lived with her husband Stephen, a German Jew, in a green-painted clapboard bungalow in Morne Smith. Brenda had tried to interest me, as do so many eager mothers, in the piano lessons in Senin, a dead loss, and the ballet lessons at Miss O'Mingay's dancing school in Penrose Terrace in Penzance, another non-starter. When Brenda mentioned this to her friend Doris, she suggested I undertake speech lessons with her at her room in West Cornwall Girls' School in Penzance, where she was then teaching elocution. Not to get rid of my Cornish accent, although that was one of the end results, but because I gabbled so fast, it was difficult to make out what I was saying. I loved it and passed all my Lambda speech medals through to gold, despite being too sibilant. So Doris did some good. Amongst other things, we ran the gamut of speech exercises from round and round the rugged rock the ragged rascal ran, to which witch had the wen on her hand when we met them, and you asked them whether we would have fine weather, delivered in received pronunciation with aspirated H's, a style now mostly outmoded. Doris often said to me, "You'll never forget this, Susan. Whenever you have to stand up in public and give a speech or attend an interview or act on the stage, you'll remember what you learned here today." And she was right. A little hovering Doris bubble appears in my mind on every such occasion. When one of my speech exams loomed, I and one or two other girls in the same plight would be invited to stay with Doris at her home in Morne Smith for a few days of intensive training. Sally Trelease was one, daughter of county drama advisor John Trelease, who was also working to restore the Cornish lugger Barnabas for the Cornish Maritime Trust, and featured in one of Brenda's TV shows for Westward. Doris was obsessed with Siamese cats. Not only did she have half a dozen living and breathing specimens, but every surface in every room in her house, tables, shelves, picture rails with shelves, cupboards, sideboards, was covered in ceramic or glass representations of them, including several of those giant-sized, coloured brandy glasses with secreted mice, with their attendant cats hanging on the edge, frozen in pursuit. In between speech training sessions, we picked hazelnuts from her trees, marvelled at the aviary with 80 noisy budgies in the garden, or went down to the creek below the house to paddle and laze. Mike Sagar Fenton tells a delicious story of Doris. Apparently she was appalled when some children in one class she was called upon to take kept using the F word in their general speech. So, "I can't fucking do it, miss," one would say. "Why must you do this?" she asked, mystified. "Why do you preface everything you say with this word fucking?" "Well, everyone does it nowadays, miss," was the general consensus. "Oh, I see," she replied, still mystified. She resolved to put this to the test. On her return home, she called out to her husband with her immaculate diction, "Hello, Stephen. I'm fucking home. I'm going to have a fucking cup of tea and a fucking sit down now. I'm fucking tired." Stephen looked up at her, horrified. "Don't you ever do that to me again," he growled. Brenda also did a few productions with the CRDF, the Cornwall Religious Drama Fellowship, in the 1950s, appearing in plays at the Minack Theatre with them, and also at the City Hall in Truro. I remember particularly Noah. Noah was played by a guy called Ted Miller, and Mrs. Noah was a sweet little lady called Mrs. Kliske. Others involved included Colin Stevenson and Vera Round. This is especially memorable for me, as Ted's daughter got the part of a lamb in Noah and I didn't. She had a congenital problem with her hand, and we were in the same room together at Tahiti Hospital throughout my convalescence there. There was also the West Cornwall Theatre Company, and several of the leading characters from both these theatre groups went on to form the Playgoers Theatre Club in Penzance around 1960. John's workplace, and the reason for our living in Sennin, was a mile or two out of the village on the Porthcurno Road. Royal Air Force Sennin was built on the site of Skewjack Farm by the RAF in 1940, as the RAF Regiment Barracks for the Greater Chainholme Station CH-17. After they were married, for a few months Brenda and John lived with his father in Wolverhampton, Brenda later moving back in with Lena and Angus, until such time as John could find work in Cornwall. But in June 1949, with Brenda pregnant, John applied for a job at Skewjack, and in September he began work as radio mechanic Class 1 at number 428 Signals Unit, RAF Sennin. He worked there throughout the 1950s, becoming a radio telecommunications technical officer grade 3, and his responsibilities, as far as I'm aware, involved monitoring and identifying whatever flew overhead, and keeping the machinery in good order. There were usually 2 men on duty, and it was shift work, allowing the station to be manned at all times. The site had a couple of 360-foot-high link aerial radar masts, which, along with all the other machinery, required regular maintenance. On August 4th, 1968, John and his mate Charlie Jollo set off to clean the machinery at the top of the tower, a regular task, and as usual, Charlie switched off the machinery at the bottom of the mast. John began the hair-raising climb to the top, and Charlie went back to the hut to carry on with the cleaning. From experience, John knew that by the time he reached the top, the motor drive would have had time to slow down and stop. Maybe he climbed a little quicker that day, as on this occasion, on reaching the top, he removed the canvas cover and the inspection panel and reached inside the awkward space with the rag in his hand to begin the cleaning. But the heavy gears hadn't quite finished rotating and were on their last turn. His rag was caught and his hand pulled into the works, severing one fingertip and smashing several others. He was trapped 360 feet up in the air, precariously balanced on a small metal platform, losing blood and in great pain, and his co-worker, the hard-of-hearing Charlie Jollo, was in the Nissen hut a little way away. He screamed for Charlie, who thankfully appeared a few minutes later and climbed the mast. But even with John's feeble attempts to help unbolt the mechanism, they couldn't release his hand. Charlie had to leave John there to climb down to phone for help, and eventually John's boss, Mr. Bradley, arrived, and between the three of them, all at the top of the tower, they at last managed to release John. He later said he couldn't remember much about it. He knew he couldn't faint, as he would likely have slipped and could have fallen and lost his hand or worse. Amazingly, he then managed to climb back down the tower and was taken to Penzance Hospital in Mr. Bradley's car and eventually to Treliske Hospital around 40 miles away. He arrived there some 4 hours after the accident, at last received his first pain-killing injection, and his hand was operated on. I dread to think what he must have gone through. By the time Brenda and I got up to Treliske a few hours later, he was white as a sheet and still in shock. Thankfully, apart from losing the tip of his forefinger, which gave him endless amusement later, pretending to pick his nose, his other fingers all healed, though they bore scars, and he was not seriously disabled. John was also a member of the Royal Observer Corps and RAYNET, the Radio Amateurs Emergency Network, and sometimes went on training exercises with a civil defence theme, usually incorporating all the different services, military and civil. He took part in a few of these, often 2-day affairs involving many volunteers, some grotesquely wounded, playing out a nightmare scenario of nuclear or other attack or natural disaster. Some years after we left Senin, he had the opportunity to go up to the Shetland Islands on an aircraft recognition refresher course. He was put in the nose of a Shackleton aircraft and taken up on a routine training flight. The weather was none too clear, I believe. Sometime into the flight, he spotted another aircraft, seemingly on a collision course with his own plane, and fearing that his pilot hadn't seen this potential danger, alerted him. The pilot, a rather well-spoken RAF chappie, responded briskly with, "Oh, good show, Nose!" Father gleefully told us this story on his return home, and forever after we were able to taunt him for all his small achievements with cries of, "Good show, Nose!" particularly when he was pretending to pick it with his shortened forefinger.